I found out my snowplow had been destroyed the same day. Martha called to inform me about 3 parking violations I'd supposedly committed over the previous week. My name is Derek Lawson, and I had been living in the Pinewood Heights subdivision in Greenwood Village, Colorado, for 6 years. The neighborhood sat on the eastern edge of the Denver metro area, a collection of 50 houses arranged in a grid pattern with tree-lined streets and sidewalks that wound through manicured lawns. When I first moved in, the place seemed perfect. Quiet neighbors, good schools nearby for when I eventually had kids, and mountain views from my back deck. The HOA seemed like a minor inconvenience at worst. That changed when Martha Hendricks became the HOA president 3 years ago. Martha was 52 years old, stood about 5'4", and had that particular shade of blonde hair that came from a bottle and a desperate need to look younger. She wore pearl earrings every single day and drove a white Lexus SUV that she parked diagonally across 2 spots in front of the clubhouse. The irony was not lost on anyone. "Derek, this is simply unacceptable," Martha's voice crackled through my phone that February morning. "Your commercial vehicle has been parked in your driveway for 7 consecutive days. That's a direct violation of Covenant Section 12, subsection 4. I stood in my garage, staring at the empty spot where my Ford F-350 with the snowplow attachment should have been. The truck wasn't there. My stomach dropped. "Martha, where's my truck?" "The vehicle was towed at 6 this morning per HOA regulations. You received written notice of the violation 3 days ago." "I never got any notice." "That's not my problem, Derek. The notice was delivered. We have a photograph of it placed in your mailbox." I walked to my mailbox and yanked it open, empty except for a Pottery Barn catalog and a credit card offer. "There's nothing here." "Again, not my problem. The towing company took it to their impound lot." "You'll need to settle your fines before retrieval. The total comes to $850. $850. For parking my own truck in my own driveway. For parking a commercial vehicle in violation of neighborhood covenants, plus towing fees, plus storage fees. The amount increases by $75 per day." She paused, and I could practically hear the satisfaction in her voice. "You really should have read the covenant before you purchased your home." I had read the covenant. The commercial vehicle clause specified that vehicles used primarily for commercial purposes couldn't be parked in driveways or streets overnight. My truck was personal. I used it for my landscaping business during the summer and for plowing my driveway and helping neighbors during winter storms, but it was registered as a personal vehicle. I had the registration to prove it. "Martha, that's my personal truck. I'm not running a business out of my driveway." "The snowplow attachment makes it commercial. The board voted unanimously. The fees stand." She hung up before I could respond. I called the towing company, a place called Rocky Mountain Auto Recovery, and got a bored-sounding guy named Carl on the phone. He confirmed the truck was there and that I needed to pay the HOA fine before release. When I asked about the snowplow attachment, Carl got quiet. "Yeah, about that. We got orders to remove any attachments that made the vehicle commercial in nature." "Remove it? What does that mean?" We cut it off, man. Boss's orders. The HOA lady was real specific about it." My hands started shaking. "You cut off my snowplow." "Look, I'm just doing what I'm told. Take it up with the HOA." The snowplow had cost me $3,000. It was a Western Pro plow with a personal attachment mount that I'd saved for over a year to buy. I used it constantly during Colorado winters, not just for myself, but for elderly neighbors who couldn't shovel. Mrs. Patterson across the street was 78 and arthritic. Mr. and Mrs. Chen next door both worked night shifts at the hospital. I plowed their driveways after every storm. I drove to the impound lot in my wife's Honda Civic. My wife Sarah had left for a nursing conference in Phoenix that morning, and I was glad she wasn't here to see this. She'd always been wary of the HOA, but I'd assured her they were mostly harmless busybodies. I was wrong. The impound lot sat off Santa Fe Drive, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. My truck was in the back corner, and even from the front gate, I could see the damage. The snowplow mounting bracket had been torch-cut from the frame. The hydraulic lines hung loose and dripping fluid. The electrical connections were severed and dangling. The plow itself sat in a twisted heap next to the truck, the blade bent and the hydraulic cylinders cracked. Carl met me at the gate. He was younger than he'd sounded on the phone, maybe 25, with grease-stained coveralls and apologetic eyes. "Man, I'm really sorry," he said. "My boss, he takes these HOA contracts real serious. They pay good money for towing rights in all the neighborhoods around here." "Who's your boss?" "Guy named Frank Mueller. He's not here right now." I took photos of everything. The damaged truck, the destroyed plow, the clean-cut marks on the frame. Then I called the police non-emergency line and filed a report for destruction of property. The dispatcher said an officer would be out within 2 hours. Officer Jennifer Morrison arrived 90 minutes later. She was thorough, taking her own photographs and statements from both me and Carl. When I explained the situation, she frowned. "HOAs can authorize towing for covenant violations," she said, "but they can't authorize destruction of property. That's different." "So what happens now?" "I'll file this report. You'll need to pursue civil action for damages." The towing company and the HOA could both be liable. She handed me a card. "I'd recommend documenting everything and consulting with an attorney." I paid the $850 with my credit card because I needed my truck back, even damaged. The tow lot released it, and I drove home with the hydraulic fluid dripping a trail behind me. When I pulled into my driveway, Martha was standing on the sidewalk with her phone out, taking pictures. "Still in violation," she called out. "The mounting bracket remains. That'll be another fine." Something inside me snapped. Not violently, but completely. I'd spent 6 years being the good neighbor, following the rules, paying my HOA dues on time, keeping my lawn exactly 2.5 inches tall per the covenant specifications. And this was what it got me. "Martha, you destroyed $3,000 worth of my property. The HOA authorized removal of commercial equipment. You're welcome to take it up with the board." She smiled, tight-lipped and cold. "Or you could just follow the rules like everyone else." I went inside and spent the next 4 hours on the phone. First with my insurance company, who informed me that vandalism claims required police reports and had a $1,000 deductible. Then with 3 different attorneys, all of whom said the same thing. Yes, I had a case, but HOA litigation was expensive and time-consuming, often costing more than the damages recovered. The last attorney I spoke with, a woman named Patricia Gomez, gave me different advice. "These cases almost never go anywhere because homeowners don't have leverage," she said. "The HOA holds all the cards. They can fine you, put liens on your property, foreclose if you don't pay. They know homeowners are trapped. The only way to win is to change the power dynamic." "How do I do that?" "You'd need to either take over the board or remove the HOA's authority entirely. Both are nearly impossible with an entrenched president like Martha Hendricks. I've dealt with her before. She runs that board like a dictatorship." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I started researching. HOA law, property rights, covenant enforcement. I went down rabbit holes about HOA abuse cases, about neighborhoods that had successfully dissolved their associations, about the legal structures that gave HOAs their power. And then I found something interesting. Most HOAs in Colorado were structured as nonprofit corporations with authority granted through property covenants, but those covenants were tied to the land itself. The HOA didn't own the streets or common areas in Pinewood Heights. Those were owned by something called the Pinewood Heights Master Association, a separate entity that predated the HOA. I dug deeper. The Master Association had been created by the original developer in 1998 when the neighborhood was built. It owned the streets, the small park at the entrance, the retention pond, and the clubhouse. The HOA essentially leased operational authority from the Master Association through a management agreement. The Master Association had 5 board members. I found their names in the county records: Robert Chen, Helen Patterson, William Drake, Susan Morneau, and the president, George Kimball. Robert Chen was my neighbor. Helen Patterson was the elderly woman I plowed out every winter. I knew both of them. The next morning I knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door. She answered in a pink cardigan and reading glasses, smiling warmly until she saw my expression. "Derek, dear, what's wrong?" I explained everything. The towing, the destroyed snowplow, Martha's threats of more fines. Mrs. Patterson's face grew stormy. "That woman is a menace," she said. "Ever since she became HOA president, this neighborhood has been insufferable. Do you know she sent me a violation notice because my rose bushes were 3 inches too tall? I've been gardening for 50 years. Mrs. Patterson, I found out you're on the Master Association board." She blinked. "Oh, that old thing. Yes, I suppose I am. We haven't met in years, honestly. The HOA handles everything." "What if it didn't? What if the Master Association took back control?" Her eyes sharpened behind her glasses. "Tell me more." We sat at her kitchen table, and I laid out what I'd learned. The Master Association had ultimate authority over the neighborhood because it owned the actual property. The HOA only operated with its permission through a management agreement that was renewable annually. That agreement was set to renew on March 1st, just 3 weeks away. If the Master Association doesn't renew the agreement, the HOA loses its authority, I said. But wouldn't that leave the neighborhood without any management? Who would maintain the common areas? The Master Association could hire a property management company directly, or handle it themselves, or dissolve entirely and deed the streets to the county. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to make some phone calls." Over the next week, everything accelerated. Mrs. Patterson contacted the other Master Association board members. Robert Chen was immediately on board after I'd plowed his driveway 100 times without asking for anything in return. William Drake, who lived 3 streets over, had been fighting with Martha for 2 years over a fence height dispute. Susan Morneau's daughter had been fined $500 for parking her car on the street overnight when visiting from California. The only holdout was George Kimball, the Master Association president. He was 71, retired from banking, and had been friends with Martha's late husband. When Mrs. Patterson called a special board meeting, he refused to attend. "We're not interfering with the HOA," he told her over the phone, loudly enough that I could hear from across Mrs. Patterson's living room. "They're doing a fine job maintaining property values." "George, they destroyed this young man's property," Mrs. Patterson said. "Then he should have followed the rules." She hung up and looked at me. "We need his vote. It requires a majority, and we're tied 2-2 with him abstaining." I thought about this. George Kimball lived in the largest house in the neighborhood, a sprawling ranch on 2 lots at the end of Pinewood Drive. I'd never spoken to him directly, but I knew he was meticulous about his property. His lawn was always perfect, his hedges trimmed to mathematical precision. I also knew he'd filed for bankruptcy in 2019. It was public record, and I'd stumbled across it while researching the Master Association board members. He'd been involved in a failed real estate investment and had lost most of his savings. The bankruptcy had been discharged, but it left him with damaged credit and limited assets. That gave me an idea. The next morning, I made an appointment with my bank. I'd been saving money for years, planning to eventually expand my landscaping business or maybe buy a rental property. I had $47,000 in savings. It seemed like a fortune when I looked at the account balance. It seemed inadequate for what I was planning. I met with a loan officer named David and explained that I was interested in acquiring property in Greenwood Village. He pulled my credit score, reviewed my income from the landscaping business, and nodded. You could qualify for a commercial property loan up to about $300,000, depending on the property, he said. What if I wanted to buy something bigger? How much bigger? I took a breath. I want to buy the streets in my neighborhood. David stared at me. I'm sorry, what? The Master Association owns the streets and common areas in Pinewood Heights. If I could buy the Master Association, I'd own everything. That's unusual. Let me talk to my manager. It took 3 days and consultations with the bank's real estate attorney, but they came back with an answer. Yes, it was theoretically possible to purchase a Master Association if the board members agreed to sell. The entity would be valued based on the property it owned plus any operational assets. The bank ordered an appraisal. The streets, clubhouse, park, and retention pond were collectively valued at $160,000. The Master Association had $12,000 in its operating account. Total value, $172,000. With my savings as a down payment, I could get a loan for the rest. The monthly payment would be steep, about $1,100, but manageable if I sold off some of the assets afterward. Now I just needed to convince the board to sell. I approached the friendly board members first. Mrs. Patterson, Robert Chen, William Drake, and Susan Morneau. I invited them to my house on a Saturday afternoon and laid out my plan. You want to buy the entire Master Association? Robert Chen asked. He was in his early 40s, an emergency room physician with steady hands and a calm demeanor that I imagined served him well at work. Yes. Then I'd have the authority to dissolve the current HOA management agreement and hire new management, or eliminate the HOA entirely. That's quite vindictive, Susan Morneau said. She was a high school teacher, mid-50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes. I don't like Martha either, but punishing the entire neighborhood? I'm not punishing anyone. I'm removing a power structure that's being abused. Once I own the streets, I can deed them to the county. That makes them public roads. The HOA would lose enforcement authority for parking violations, for one thing. What about maintenance? William Drake asked. He was an accountant, methodical and detail-oriented. The HOA fees pay for landscaping, snow removal, clubhouse maintenance. Those services can still be managed through a property management company, just without the ridiculous enforcement nonsense. I'd keep the essential services. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. But you still need George's vote to sell, don't you? Yes, that's the problem. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Robert Chen said, What if we remove George from the board first? Can you do that? The Master Association bylaws allow for removal of a board member with a majority vote for cause. Refusing to attend board meetings could qualify. William Drake nodded slowly. We'd need to document it properly. call a meeting, have him refuse again, then vote to remove him for abandoning his responsibilities. Then we'd appoint a replacement who'd vote to approve the sale. It felt manipulative, but George had already refused to even discuss the situation. And legally, it was allowed under the bylaws. We called a special meeting for the following Tuesday. Mrs. Patterson sent certified letters to all board members, including George Kimball. The meeting agenda had one item: discussion and vote regarding HOA management agreement renewal. George didn't show up. We waited 30 minutes past the scheduled start time in Mrs. Patterson's living room, the 4 board members and me. Finally, William Drake made a motion to remove George Kimball from the board for failure to attend meetings and fulfill his responsibilities. Robert Chen seconded. The vote was unanimous among those present: 4 in favor, none opposed, 1 absent. Then Susan Morneau nominated me to fill the vacant position. I was a property owner within the Master Association boundaries, which made me eligible. Another unanimous vote. Just like that, I was on the board of the entity that controlled my neighborhood. William Drake, always the accountant, had printed out a purchase agreement he drafted. It was straightforward. I would purchase the Pinewood Heights Master Association for $172,000. The existing board members would retain no liability for past actions. The sale would close within 30 days. We voted. 5 in favor, none opposed. I signed the purchase agreement with a shaking hand. Martha found out 2 days later. She showed up at my door at 7 in the morning, pounding hard enough to rattle the frame. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shouted when I opened the door. "Good morning, Martha. You cannot buy the Master Association. That's illegal." "It's not. I checked with 3 attorneys." Her face was red, her pearl earrings swaying as she shook with anger. "The HOA will sue. We'll block this. The HOA has no authority over Master Association decisions. You might want to read your own management agreement. You're doing this because of your stupid truck. This is retaliation. This is me exercising my legal right to purchase property. The board voted to sell. The transaction is happening." She stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "When this falls through, and it will, I'm going to fine you for every single violation I can find. You'll owe so much money you'll have to sell your house. Get off my property, Martha. This is HOA property. The sidewalk, the street, all of it. I have every right to be here. Actually, as of 2 days ago, I'm a board member of the entity that owns this property. And as a board member, I'm informing you that you're trespassing. Leave now or I'll call the police." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing. Then she turned and stormed back to her white Lexus, which she'd parked blocking my driveway. The next 3 weeks were chaos. Martha called an emergency HOA board meeting and passed a resolution declaring the Master Association sale void. It had no legal effect, but she sent copies to every homeowner in the neighborhood, along with a letter claiming I was staging a hostile takeover that would eliminate property maintenance and tank home values. Several neighbors called me, concerned. I explained the situation honestly. The HOA had destroyed my property. I was taking control of the underlying authority to prevent further abuse, and essential services would continue. Most people were understanding. A few weren't. The Hendersons, who lived 2 doors down, started a petition to stop the sale. They got 37 signatures out of 50 households. It didn't matter legally, but it stung. These were people I'd lived near for years, and they believed Martha's narrative. My attorney, Patricia Gomez, sent a cease and desist letter to Martha demanding she stop making false claims about the sale. Martha responded by filing a lawsuit against me personally and the Master Association board members, claiming breach of fiduciary duty and conspiracy to defraud. "This is a nuisance suit," Patricia told me over the phone. "She has no grounds, but it'll take time and money to dismiss." "How much time?" "Months, probably, and several $1,000s in legal fees." Sarah came home from Phoenix in the middle of all this. When I explained what had happened, she sat on our couch for a long time without speaking. "Derek, this is insane," she finally said. "You're buying an entire neighborhood infrastructure because of a snowplow. Because they destroyed my property and threatened to keep destroying my life if I didn't submit to their authority. So your solution is to, what? Become the authority yourself. To eliminate the authority. Once I own the streets, I'm deeding them to Arapahoe County, public roads. No more HOA parking enforcement, no more towing, no more arbitrary fines. And the lawsuit, Patricia says we'll win, it's just harassment." Sarah rubbed her temples. "This is going to cost us everything we've saved, I know. And you're still doing it." "I am." She looked at me for a long moment, and I couldn't read her expression. Then she said, "Okay, but if this goes wrong, you're the one explaining it to our future kids why we can't afford college." The sale closed on February 28th, one day before the HOA management agreement was set to auto-renew. I signed approximately 40 documents at a title company office in downtown Denver, transferred $172,000, and became the sole owner of the Pinewood Heights Master Association. Patricia had advised restructuring it as a single-member LLC, which gave me personal liability protection. So technically, Lawson Property Holdings LLC owned the Master Association. But I was the sole member of the LLC, which meant I controlled everything. My first action was to send a letter to the Pinewood Heights HOA board informing them that their management agreement would not be renewed. Effective March 1st, they had no authority to enforce covenants, levy fines, or authorize towing within Pinewood Heights. My second action was to hire a property management company called Summit Services to handle actual maintenance. They would manage landscaping, snow removal, clubhouse scheduling, and pond maintenance. Their monthly fee was $3,000, which I would cover by charging homeowners a voluntary quarterly assessment of $60. The HOA had been charging $90 per quarter, so this was actually a savings. My third action was to start the process of deeding the streets to Arapahoe County. This required applications, surveys, inspections, and approximately 6 months of bureaucratic processing. But once complete, they'd become public roads under county maintenance. Martha's response was nuclear. She called another HOA meeting and passed a resolution placing a lien on my house for unpaid fines and fees totaling $17,000. The amount was entirely fabricated, based on retroactive violations she'd invented going back 3 years. Patricia got a court order blocking the lien within 48 hours, but the damage was done. The title company for the couple buying the Hendersons' house found the lien during a title search, and the sale fell through. The Hendersons blamed me, even though Martha had filed the false lien. Then Martha escalated further. She hired a private investigator to follow me, documenting everywhere I went and everyone I met with. The PI was obvious about it, parking outside my house in a gray Dodge Charger and trailing me to the grocery store, the bank, and Summit Services office. I filed a police report for stalking. Officer Morrison, the same cop who'd taken my initial report about the destroyed snowplow, came to my house and took my statement. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "Have you considered just moving? That's what she wants. I'm not leaving." The investigator kept following me. Then Martha started attending Greenwood Village Town Council meetings and speaking during public comment periods, claiming I was operating an illegal business and endangering the neighborhood. The town sent a code enforcement officer to inspect my property. He found nothing wrong and left after 20 minutes, but the harassment was constant. In late March, someone slashed all 4 tires on my truck. It was parked in my driveway, and the cuts were clean, done with a knife. I filed another police report. No witnesses, no suspects, but I knew who was behind it. Sarah found dog feces smeared on her car windshield one morning. We didn't own a dog. Neither did any of our immediate neighbors. Robert Chen got a notice from the town claiming his medical license was under review for unpaid parking tickets. The tickets didn't exist. It took him 3 days and a lawyer to get it resolved. Mrs. Patterson received a letter from the IRS claiming she owed back taxes. It was a fake letter, printed on counterfeit IRS letterhead. Martha was waging a campaign of psychological warfare, and it was working. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump. I installed security cameras around my house and caught someone spray painting "traitor" on my garage door at 2 in the morning. The person wore a ski mask and gloves, and the video quality wasn't good enough to identify them. Patricia filed for a restraining order against Martha. The hearing was set for April 15th. Meanwhile, the lawsuit Martha had filed was grinding forward. We'd filed a motion to dismiss, and the judge had scheduled oral arguments for May. Patricia was confident we'd win, but it meant more legal fees and more stress. The voluntary assessment notices went out to homeowners in early April. $60 per household, due quarterly, to pay for Summit Services maintenance work. 42 households paid immediately. 8 didn't respond. The Hendersons sent back their notice with fraud written across it in red marker. I didn't enforce the assessment. It was voluntary. Instead, I paid the shortfall out of pocket, another $500 per month on top of the loan payment. My savings were evaporating. Sarah started picking up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. We didn't talk about it, but I knew it was to cover the money I was hemorrhaging into this fight. The restraining order hearing arrived on a Tuesday morning. Patricia and I sat at the petitioner's table in Arapahoe County District Court. Martha sat across the aisle with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Frost, who specialized in HOA law. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Honor Barbara Trent. She'd been on the bench for 20 years, and her expression suggested she'd seen everything and was impressed by nothing. Patricia presented our evidence: the destroyed snowplow, the false lien, the stalking, the harassment of board members, the vandalism. We had photos, police reports, and affidavits from Mrs. Patterson and Robert Chen. Richard Frost argued that Martha was simply exercising her rights as HOA president to enforce neighborhood covenants, and that any harassment was unproven speculation. Judge Trent listened to both sides, asked pointed questions, and then took a 30-minute recess to review the evidence. When she returned, she looked directly at Martha. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'm granting a temporary restraining order," she said. "You are prohibited from contacting Mr. Lawson directly or indirectly, from coming within 100 yards of his property, and from filing any further liens or legal actions related to this dispute without court approval. This order is effective immediately and will remain in place pending a full hearing in 60 days. Martha's face went white. "Your Honor, I'm the HOA president. I need to be able to communicate about neighborhood matters." "You can communicate through your attorney or through written notices sent to all homeowners equally. You cannot single out Mr. Lawson for targeted harassment, which is what the evidence suggests you've been doing. This is outrageous. He's destroying our neighborhood. Mrs. Hendricks, one more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. You understand? Martha's attorney put a hand on her arm. She nodded stiffly. The restraining order was a relief, but it didn't stop everything. Martha couldn't contact me directly, but she could still spread misinformation through neighborhood group chats and next-door posts. She organized a Save Pinewood Heights committee that met weekly at the clubhouse I now technically owned. In late April, the committee sent a letter to every homeowner proposing to create a new HOA with even stricter rules. They needed a majority of homeowners to sign on. The letter painted me as a tyrant who was destroying property values and eliminating community standards. 19 households signed up for Martha's new HOA proposal. Not enough to form a majority, but enough to create a divided neighborhood. People stopped waving when I drove past. Parents pulled their kids inside when I walked down the street. The Chens were still friendly, and Mrs. Patterson remained my staunchest defender, but I felt isolated. The motion to dismiss Martha's lawsuit was heard on May 3rd. Patricia argued for 30 minutes, citing case law and precedent. Richard Frost argued that the Master Association Board had violated its fiduciary duty by selling to me at below market value and without proper notice to HOA homeowners. Judge Trent, who was assigned to this case as well, dismissed the suit with prejudice, meaning it couldn't be refiled. The Master Association is a separate legal entity with its own board and authority, she said. The HOA has no standing to challenge its internal decisions. If individual board members believed there was wrongdoing, they could bring suit personally, but the HOA itself has no claim here. Victory, but an expensive one. Patricia's bill was approaching $15,000. In June, I submitted the final paperwork to Arapahoe County to transfer the streets. The county engineer reviewed the roads, confirmed they met county standards, and accepted the dedication. On June 22nd, Pinewood Lane, Pinewood Drive, Pinewood Court, and Pinewood Circle became public roads maintained by the county. This meant several things. First, the county was now responsible for snow plowing, street repairs, and signage. Second, parking enforcement became the responsibility of the Greenwood Village Police Department, not the HOA. Third, the HOA's covenants regarding street parking were now unenforceable because they couldn't regulate public property. I sent a notice to every homeowner explaining the change. Most people were relieved. The constant parking violation notices had been a source of stress for everyone, not just me. Martha lost her mind. She showed up at a town council meeting and demanded that Greenwood Village reject the street dedication. The town attorney explained that it was already complete and legally binding. She threatened to sue the town. The mayor politely told her to leave. That night my house was egged. All the windows on the front facade, my truck, Sarah's car. The security cameras caught 2 teenagers doing it, boys I didn't recognize. I sent the footage to Officer Morrison. The boys were picked up the next day. They were 16 and 17, sons of 2 families in the neighborhood. When questioned, they admitted Martha had paid them each $50 to vandalize my house. That was the mistake that changed everything. Officer Morrison called me the following afternoon. Mr. Lawson, we're charging Martha Hendricks with criminal mischief and contributing to the delinquency of minors. I thought you'd want to know. You're arresting her. We have the teenager's statements, plus text messages where she solicited them to commit vandalism. It's pretty clear-cut. Martha was arrested on June 28th at her home. She was processed at the Arapahoe County Jail, charged, and released on a $5,000 bond. The mugshot appeared on the local news website within hours. The neighborhood erupted. Some people were horrified that Martha had hired teenagers to vandalize property. Others claimed it was a setup, that I'd somehow coerced the boys into lying. The Facebook group for Pinewood Heights became a war zone of accusations and arguments. Mrs. Patterson called me that evening. "Derek, dear, I think you need to address the neighborhood directly. People are frightened and confused. They need to hear from you." "I've sent letters explaining everything." "Letters aren't enough. They need to see you're not the villain Martha's made you out to be." I didn't want to face a crowd of angry neighbors, but she was right. I drafted an email and sent it to the full neighborhood mailing list, inviting anyone interested to a community meeting at the clubhouse on July 5th at 7 p.m. 34 people showed up. The clubhouse had a capacity of 50, and the room felt tense and crowded. Martha wasn't there. She was prohibited by the restraining order, but her supporters were. The Hendersons sat in the front row with their arms crossed. Behind them were the Carlsons, the Mitchells, and several other families I recognized but didn't know well. Mrs. Patterson sat on one side with Robert Chen and his wife. William Drake and Susan Morneau were there. Sarah sat next to me at the front table. I stood and faced the crowd. My mouth was dry, but I forced myself to speak clearly. "Thank you for coming. I know there's been a lot of confusion and anger over the past few months. I want to explain exactly what happened and why I made the decisions I did." I walked through the timeline. The truck being towed, the snowplow being destroyed, Martha's escalating fines and harassment. I showed photos of the damaged equipment and the police reports. I explained the master association purchase and the street dedication to the county. "I didn't do this to hurt anyone," I said. "I did it because the HOA, under Martha's leadership, had become abusive. She destroyed my property and threatened to keep punishing me if I didn't comply with arbitrary rules. When I looked for legal options, I found that the only way to stop her was to remove her authority. So I did." Tom Henderson stood up. "You've destroyed our property values. Homes in HOA neighborhoods sell for more because buyers know there are standards. We still have standards. Summit Services is maintaining all the common areas. The landscaping looks as good as it ever has. The only thing that changed is that parking violations are now handled by the police, not by Martha. You've divided this neighborhood. Martha divided this neighborhood when she started abusing her power. I'm just trying to live in my house without being harassed." "You could have just moved," someone called from the back. "Why should I move? I bought my house legally. I followed the rules. She's the one who broke the law by destroying my property and hiring teenagers to vandalize my home. She's been arrested, not me." That got some murmurs. Not everyone had heard about the arrest details. Susan Morneau stood. "I want to say something. I've lived here for 12 years. When Martha became president, the fines started piling up for everyone. My daughter got fined for parking on the street overnight. That's normal in every neighborhood except this one. My neighbors got fined for having their trash cans visible from the street a day after pickup, for having the wrong shade of white on their mailbox. This wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about control and power." Robert Chen stood next. "Martha sent me a violation notice because my car was parked 6 inches over the driveway edge onto my own lawn. 6 inches. The fine was $200. This was never about protecting property values. It was about harassment." The room was quieter now. People were listening. Mrs. Patterson stood, leaning on her cane. "I've lived in this neighborhood since it was built in 1998. I remember when we were all friendly, when we had block parties and helped each other. Martha killed that. She made everyone afraid of their neighbors because you never knew who would report you to the HOA. Derek didn't destroy this community. He's trying to save it from what Martha turned it into." We talked for another hour. Some people remained angry, convinced I'd overstepped. But more people than I expected were supportive or at least understanding. By the time the meeting ended, the temperature in the room had shifted from hostile to divided. Martha's criminal case moved forward through July and August. She pleaded not guilty, claiming the boys were lying. The prosecutor offered a plea deal: guilty to criminal mischief, a misdemeanor, with 6 months probation and restitution for the damage. Martha refused. The case went to trial in September. I testified about the harassment and vandalism. The 2 teenagers testified, reluctant and embarrassed, about Martha paying them to egg my house. The prosecution presented text messages that were damning. The jury convicted her in 40 minutes. The judge sentenced her to 90 days in jail, suspended to 60 days probation, plus 1 year of supervised probation, and full restitution to me and the families of the teenagers for legal fees. She was also ordered to perform 100 hours of community service and attend anger management counseling. Martha resigned as HOA president the next day. The remaining board members, without her influence, voted to dissolve the Pinewood Heights HOA entirely. The covenants remained attached to the property deeds, but without an active HOA, there was no one to enforce them. It was over. By October, life in Pinewood Heights had started to normalize. Summit Services continued maintaining the common areas funded by voluntary assessments that now had 47 out of 50 households participating. The streets were clean, the park was maintained, and no one was getting arbitrary fines. I bought a new snowplow attachment for my truck in November. When the first big storm hit in early December, I plowed my driveway, then Mrs. Patterson's, then the Chen's. Tom Henderson flagged me down as I drove past his house. "Could you do mine?" he asked, awkward and gruff. "I'll pay you, no charge," I said. "We're neighbors." He nodded, still uncomfortable but grateful. Sarah and I hosted a holiday party in mid-December. 20 families came, more than I'd expected. People brought cookies and drinks. Kids played in the snow outside. For the first time in almost a year, the neighborhood felt like a community again. Mrs. Patterson pulled me aside at one point. "You did a good thing, Derek. I know it didn't feel like it during all the mess, but you stood up to a bully. That matters." "I just wanted to keep my snowplow," she laughed. "Well, you certainly took the long way around." In January, I received a check for $8,300. It was the restitution from Martha, covering the destroyed snowplow, the vandalism, repairs, and some of my legal fees. It didn't cover everything I'd spent, not even close, but it was something. I also received a letter from the Master Association's insurance company. They were suing the towing company, Frank Mueller's Rocky Mountain Auto Recovery, for the destruction of my snowplow. Martha had given them authorization to tow, but not to destroy property. The insurance company believed they could recover the full damages plus legal fees. If they won, they'd reimburse me for my deductible and other expenses. That case was still pending, but it was nice to know someone was holding the towing company accountable. Sarah and I sat on our back deck one evening in late January, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and orange. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for a long time. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The whole insane fight." I thought about that. I'd spent nearly $30,000 when including the loan payments, legal fees, and out-of-pocket expenses. I'd endured months of harassment and stress. I'd become a pariah to half my neighbors, at least temporarily, but I still lived in my house. I could park my truck in my driveway without fear. I could help my neighbors without worrying about covenant violations. And Martha Hendricks no longer had the power to ruin people's lives over arbitrary rules. "No," I said. "I don't regret it. Sarah reached over and took my hand. Good. Because we're completely broke and can't afford to move even if we wanted to. I laughed. It felt good to laugh. The lawsuit against the Master Association that Martha had filed was dismissed permanently in February. The judge ruled that not only did she lack standing, but the suit had been filed in bad faith as retaliation. She was ordered to pay Patricia's legal fees, another $12,000. I doubted I'd ever see that money, but the vindication felt good. In March, the county completed repaving Pinewood Drive, which had been cracking and potholed for years. Under HOA management, street repairs had been deferred to save money for Martha's pet projects. Under county management, they were fixed within months of the dedication. People noticed. The Carlsons, who had been vocal critics of my takeover, stopped me while I was checking my mailbox one afternoon. Janet Carlson, a woman in her 50s who worked as a real estate agent, actually smiled. "Derek, I owe you an apology," she said. "I thought you were going to destroy the neighborhood, but honestly, it's better now. No more threatening letters, no more ridiculous fines, just normal suburban life." "I appreciate that, Janet. I heard you're still paying part of the Summit Services bill out of pocket because not everyone pays the assessment. It's only a few hundred a month. Not a big deal." "That's not fair to you. Let me talk to some people. We should make the assessment mandatory, or at least get everyone to pay their share." She was true to her word. By April, all 50 households were contributing to the quarterly assessment. With full participation, I was actually breaking even on maintenance costs. The loan payment for purchasing the Master Association was still a burden, but at least I wasn't drowning. In May, I did something I'd been thinking about for months. I called a meeting of all homeowners and proposed dissolving the Master Association entirely and giving ownership of the remaining common property, the clubhouse and the park, to the homeowners collectively as tenants in common. "I never wanted to own all this," I explained to the 40 people gathered at the clubhouse. "I just wanted to stop the abuse. The streets are now county property. Summit Services can be hired directly by a homeowner committee. There's no reason for the Master Association to exist anymore." The vote was unanimous in favor. I worked with Patricia to draw up the paperwork, and by July, I no longer owned the Pinewood Heights Master Association. The clubhouse and park were collectively owned by all 50 households, managed by a volunteer committee of 5 homeowners who would rotate annually. I still had the loan to pay off, $172,000, borrowed at a 5% interest rate with a 15-year term. But I'd negotiated with the bank to allow me to sell off some of the individual assets before the dissolution. The retention pond, which had required costly maintenance, was sold to the county for $20,000 as part of stormwater management infrastructure. The clubhouse, which I'd retained briefly before the dissolution, was sold to the homeowner collective for $60,000, appraised value. With those sales, plus the restitution from Martha and the insurance settlement from the towing company that finally came through in August for $41,000, I'd recovered most of my costs. I still owed about $50,000 on the loan, which would take years to pay off, but it was manageable. More importantly, I'd accomplished what I set out to do. The HOA was gone. Martha was gone. She'd actually moved out of the neighborhood in June, selling her house at a loss because she couldn't stand the judgment from neighbors. The streets were public. The common areas were maintained, and people were friendly again. On a Saturday in late September, we had a neighborhood block party. It was Robert Chen's idea, a celebration of the first anniversary of normalcy. Someone set up a grill. Kids ran around playing tag. Adults stood in clusters talking and laughing. Tom Henderson approached me with a beer in hand. "Lawson, I was wrong about you. You're stubborn as hell, but you were right. This is better." "Thanks, Tom. Although I still think you're crazy for spending 6 figures to get revenge on Martha." "It wasn't revenge, it was justice." Potato, potato. He grinned and wandered off to join another conversation. Sarah found me by the grill flipping burgers. "You look happy." "I am happy. This is what I wanted, a normal neighborhood. It only cost us our entire savings and a year of hell. Worth it." She kissed my cheek. "You're ridiculous, but I love you." Mrs. Patterson came over with a plate of cookies. "Derek, dear, I made these for you. Chocolate chip, your favorite." "Mrs. Patterson, you didn't have to do that." "Nonsense. You saved this neighborhood from a tyrant. The least I can do is bake you cookies." "I just bought some property and changed some paperwork." "You stood up when no one else would. That takes courage." She patted my hand. "Your snowplow looks very nice, by the way. I saw you using it last winter." "Thanks. It works great. Good. We'll need it this winter." The Farmer's Almanac says we're in for heavy snow. As evening fell and the party wound down, I stood in the middle of Pinewood Drive, a public street now, and looked around at my neighborhood. Families cleaning up, kids being herded toward bed, neighbors saying goodnight. This was what I'd fought for. Not revenge against Martha Hendricks, though her arrest and conviction had been satisfying. Not ownership of streets and property, which I'd given up as soon as I could. But the right to live in my home without fear, to park my truck in my driveway, to help my neighbors without bureaucratic interference. The HOA had tried to control every aspect of our lives through fear and fines. They destroyed my property when I didn't comply. They'd escalated to stalking, harassment, and vandalism. But in the end, they'd lost. Because I'd found the one thing they couldn't control, the legal structure that gave them authority, and I dismantled it piece by piece, legally and permanently. It had cost me almost everything I'd saved. It had aged me. It had tested my marriage and my sanity. But standing there on that September evening, watching my neighbors laugh and talk like friends, I knew I'd make the same choice again. Some fights are worth having, even when they seem crazy. Even when everyone tells you to just let it go, move on, accept the injustice. Sometimes you have to fight back, not with violence but with knowledge and determination, and an absurd willingness to buy an entire street just to prove a point. I went inside, helped Sarah clean up, and went to bed in my house in my neighborhood, finally at peace. The snowplow sat in my garage, ready for winter. No one would destroy it again. No one would fine me for parking my truck. The HOA was gone and I was home.